Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everybody. Welcome back to my YouTube channel and to another instalment in the Sydney Railroad build. If you're watching last time, you will have seen me get the peninsula ready for track, and I've just mentioned that I was about to move over to the harbour area and lay the track there, and actually that's what I did in reality. But now I think is a good time to present another video that I've been itching to do for a while. Some months ago, the client asked me to provide for him a sample of some scenery, which is something that I did earlier this year. I didn't send him any progress reports because he said he would like to be surprised. Well, Peter, if you are watching, here is your surprise. So without further ado, let's just head out to the workshop and do some scenery. In this first slide, we can see the bare benchwork with the divided main line curving through it. The bridge and its abutments are in place, but there is no sign of any scenery. Now, as there is a water feature in this area, the first thing I need to do is get a solid base in for that. In this view, I have cut a piece of plywood the right size for the base, although it's not yet the right height, it's just resting on the frame. At this point I did some experimentation to decide exactly how high it needed to be, and just out of the picture on the right there is a trestle where the same stream comes back into view, and I have to make sure that the base here is higher than the water level in the next scene. Otherwise it's not going to look right. Here is the water base permanently installed at the right height. You can see in the top right corner the trestle scene I was mentioning earlier, and the riverbed here is about an inch higher than it is where it goes back under the trestle. In this view I have prepped the first 8 feet of the fascia. I start by clamping it in place and drawing round all the supports so I know where to put the glue. Here is that section of fascia installed with a bunch of clamps and wood blocks. I just use whatever I need to get it to sit in exactly the right place, and then I just leave it there for a few hours while the glue sets, because I don't want to risk disturbing it. And in a situation like this where I have to bend it around quite a sharp curve, I like to leave it overnight. Here is that same view with the clamps removed, ready for me to start building the scenery on top of it. At this point I turn my attention to the retaining wall on the rear track. I'm using several Woodland Scenics retaining walls. I don't know why this one is discoloured, but it doesn't matter, it's going to get painted anyway. And you can see my method here is to start with a piece of plywood screwed vertically underneath the sub-road bed, and then a narrow shelf at the bottom that all the castings will rest on. Here is the area with 6 wall sections installed. Note that on all but the first one I have to cut off one of the abutments on one side to make it look right, because obviously we don't want 2 abutments side by side with a crack between them. And notice in this view we've got a stone retaining wall on the rear track and concrete bridge abutments on the front track. And the intention here is to show the history of the area, with the track at the rear having been the first one built and the one in front added later. On some of the views from a higher level where you can see the track better, you'll notice that the rear track has concrete ties, telling the viewer that it has been replaced at some time, whereas the front track is still the original, as it has not yet worn out. With the retaining wall done, I've now gone back to fascia. Right in the middle of this frame, just under that block of plywood, is the end of the first piece I installed. I've now extended it to the benchwork joint, and there will be 2 other smaller pieces added to it eventually. It's quite easy to join fascia together using strips of the same material as splice plates behind it. You can see those held in place with the small clamps, and the next piece to go in is just sitting on the track behind. Here is the first section of fascia on the next section. In the middle of the frame where I've joined the fascia is actually the next benchwork joint, where you can see those 2 risers up to the track bed close together. More fascia work. My method here is to go alternately from one end to the other, working on one end while the glue is drying at the other. And now it's finally time to get to the fun stuff, actually building the scenery. I'm building up the rough contours with blocks of 2-inch thick foam. It's sold in home improvement stores for insulating houses. This is the grey stuff from Lowe's. If you go to Menards or Home Depot you'll get pink. And it really doesn't matter because it's the same stuff. Now at this point I already have a rough idea of what I want the shape of the landscape to be, and I'm building it up, in most cases aiming to put on a little bit more than I want so that I can trim it to shape later. as that gives me more options. In the next few slides, I'm going to continue to stack the foam blocks. In this view, most of the foam blocks have been stacked in the middle portion of the scene. I haven't started at the two ends yet where the tunnels are going. I need to get the tunnel portals installed first. In this view, I have started to carve the foam blocks. I used to use a drywall saw for this, but my tool of choice now is an end cutting oscillating saw, which makes short work of it. Once again, I'm going to cycle through a few slides fairly quickly, showing more development in the carving stage. And here the carving is pretty much done on all the blocks that I've stacked. Of course, it's a big mess to get cleaned up, because with the static build-up, the dust just sticks to everything. In this view, I have vacuumed up all the dust, and I've also super elevated the track. It's probably not very clear at the moment, but there is a much better view later in this slideshow. And also at this point, I have installed a drain pipe in the retaining wall at the back. I just drilled a hole in the plaster casting very carefully with the drill on slow speed, and then inserted a short piece of brass tubing. It doesn't matter that you can't see all the way through it, just make sure the inside of it is painted black. In this view, I have painted the track. For this job, I use a rattle can of red oxide, which I think is a pretty good base for a rust colour. And then I come back and I hit the ties with a dark brown. And I do that very roughly with a fairly runny paint so that it's not even. And I also hit the brass tubing with the red oxide primer while I was at it, because the paints I use for the rest of the scenery won't stick to bare metal. In this view, we can see that I have ballasted the track through the twin tunnels that frame one end of the scene. It's important to do it now because it'll be very difficult to reach later. And if it's not done, the whole area will just look like crap. And here's a view of the other end with the track ballasted through the rock bore that passes just behind the support post. And this view also clearly shows my method for super elevating the track. When I install the curves, I only glue down the inside end of the ties. And at this point, I've come back and I've inserted shims of 60 thou styrene under the outer end of the ties, giving it a scale 5 inches of super elevation. And at the ends of the curve, I drop down from 60 to 40 and then 20, gradually dropping down to 0 through the easement at the end of the curve. In this view, I have started working on the twin tunnels at the left of the scene. On the lower track, we have concrete tunnels and retaining walls, and ultimately we'll have cut stone tunnels and retaining walls on the rear track, which is the older one. Now, something that should have been obvious, but it hadn't occurred to me until I got to this point, was just how much the top of the double stack leans over on the super elevated curve. So I've had to carefully adjust the position of the tunnel portal so that the track is slightly towards the outside of it, and even so the top edge of the upper container is significantly closer to the inside of the tunnel portal than it is on the outside. In this view, I've started working on the second tunnel behind it. That has now reached the same point as the lower one, with the tunnel portal and the retaining walls being cut to fit. Here I am starting to work on the tunnel liners, and for these I use a product called Shaper Sheet by Woodland Scenics. It's basically a felt-like fabric glued to a heavy-duty kitchen foil, and the trick here is to cut a piece about 20 to 30% larger than you need it, crumple it up and then flatten it out again, putting lots of creases, which when painted makes a pretty good rendition of the inside of a tunnel. I have tried using it on visible rock faces, but I don't like it. It doesn't have enough detail for any area that can be viewed up close, but it's perfectly adequate for the inside of a tunnel. In this view, I have already painted the inside of the Shaper Sheet, and while the paint is drying, I'm just finishing off building the rear tunnel. Here we can see a low-level view, the difference between the tunnel with the liner installed and the one without it. It makes a huge difference, and it's definitely worth doing. In this view, I still don't have the liner for the rear tunnel, but I have cut in a small retaining wall on the rear track. I felt it was needed, and the method of getting this in the right place was exactly the same as I showed you on the larger retaining wall next to it. In this view, I have finished building the tunnels. I've stacked a lot of foam blocks over them, and you can see I've also put a retaining wall on the front track. while the rear track is a plaster casting. The front one, representing the concrete retaining wall, is scratch built from styrene. In this view I have carved all the new foam that has been stacked above the tunnels, and you can see here just how much mess it makes. I haven't yet done any cleaning up. And here it is with the mess cleaned up, all ready for the next step. In this view I have covered most of the foam blocks with plaster cloth, and at this point I get a good indication of what the finished landscape is going to look like, and also at this stage I always find places where I can improve it, so I will end up going back, cutting into the plaster cloth and reshaping the foam, just making minor changes that improve the shape of the landscape. And with every scene it's important to visualize what the landscape looked like before the railroad was there, and to try to make it look as though the railroad was cut through, taking the most economical route. Although the right end of the scene is somewhat less developed, that's because I ran out of shaper sheet and had to order another piece for the third tunnel. But other than that, the basic landforms are done, and for next week's instalment I will get the scene finished. Well, that's as far as I'm going to go for this week's instalment. I wasn't sure whether to do it in one episode or two, and as it was taking so long to edit the voiceover, I decided to break it here. I think this is a good place to break it, and I think it's around about halfway through. So I'm going to sign off here, and I'll finish this area of scenery next week. Hope to see you back here for that. In the meantime, thanks for watching, and bye for now.